Hello, everyone on YouTube. Welcome to the latest installment of David Galata Book Dreamer. Man, that's me. And I am the book dreamer because I dream all my books, and my books are based on my dreams. I'm also the author of Favorite Son and Clockmaker. And today, these two are kind of a nice little introduction because my topic today is why fantasy? Why do we go with fantasy? Some people mix fantasy with science fiction. They think that they're the same thing. I don't really know if that's necessarily true, although they can blend. You can have science fiction with some fantasy elements, and you can certainly have fantasy with science fiction elements. Steampunk is an excellent example of the latter, where you've got dirigibles, where you've got steam-powered devices, you've got all kinds of nifty things, but you can also have things like power crystals and, strange Gauss machines and all that. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. Alchemy, which would replace chemistry. Although chemistry arose from alchemy, let's not forget that. Let us not forget that our sciences emerged from studies that today we would consider mythological and fantastical. Doesn't mean the science is invalid, but when we look at its roots, the science and the technology we have today would be considered the wildest of fantasies just 100 years ago. So science fiction is based on scientific facts, and the authors of science fiction are then taking suppositions based on scientific theories and scientific facts and putting them to their extremes, and then seeing, oh, let's see, how would humanity respond to that? And, how would that change this aspect of our culture, and how might it reinforce that aspect of our culture? And, we can dream up some interesting ideas based on that. But fantasy is not necessarily based on anything at all. It is an exercise in pure imagination. So why do we need fantasy? Well, I'll tell you. Fantasy allows our imaginations to grow broader. It allows us to think about things and pick and choose which ones are interesting without having to worry about, is that a fact or is this based on a theory? We're looking at not just what ifs, because that can also be in the realm of science fiction. Well, we can look at things that might seem on the surface to be outrageous and fantastical, but can lead to very interesting places elsewhere. One great example of this is the idea of multiple universes. Now, at one time, multiple universes was considered strictly fantasy. That was just fantasy. There was nothing of science in that. We called them the worlds of our imagination. And in fact, I do believe the fantasy author Michael Moorcock did coin the term multiverse, which was a major factor in his fantasy books, was that there was the realm of the million spheres, each sphere being a component of a multiverse system that he wrote about and still continues to write about. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate your work. But this is the thing. In today's science, when we look at quantum mechanics, well, there's multiple universes. Oh dear. Suddenly, the fantastical does not seem quite so fantastical. In fact, now it sounds like science fiction as opposed to straight fantasy, with elves and dwarves and things like that, and ogres. And yet, now we find that our universe may not be alone. Fantasy led the way, just like occult alchemy led the way to chemistry. We wouldn't have even delved into the known elements had the alchemists not been searching for the philosopher's stone or being able to transmute one item, lead to gold, that kind of thing. These experiments and these thoughts led to the scientific principles we now have today. And we see the proof of these scientific principles in the very device that you're either holding or sitting in front of and watching this. There's your proof right there. Being able to take someone's image and transport it to other people's homes would have seemed outlandish in Jules Verne's time, or H.G. Wells. And he was the one who was talking about time travel, which again seems fantastical, but now it's in the realm of science fiction. Fantasies many times have a basis on fables and myths of our deep past. One example is the orc, which first really appeared in fantasy literature via Tolkien. Now, the word orc basically meant demon. Although I forget what language that is the case, my apologies. But Tolkien utilized that. The idea of elves and dwarves were very much a Northern Europe fable, a myth, that the dwarves were able to be such incredible miners and craftsmen, that the elves were one with nature and were able to talk to the trees and animals, and these were considered at the time to be spirits of such things. These fables left behind rich stories that were later expanded upon in works of fantasy. There's a lot of myths out there. There are myths from India, myths from China, myths from Japan. Every culture in this world has its mythological subsets. Those myths speak very closely about how we human beings look at the world, how we relate to the reality that we find ourselves in. We use these myths as metaphors, as parables, to help guide us. And that is an important idea. We can take those same fables and myths and transform them for a more modern audience. With today's technologies, it was only a matter of time before steampunk became a genre that we all enjoy, with exceptions, for those of you who don't like steampunk. I personally, I like it when it's well written. You see, there's my little thing, and we'll talk about that at another time. Writing nicely as opposed to very sloppy writing. That's a whole other talk, though. Fantasy is important because it reaffirms our fables and myths. It breathes new life into them. It brings them closer to home because the fantasy realm talks about these things from a modern perspective, and cultures do change and shift, much like language does, much like the sciences do. What was scientific fact 100 years ago, there's only a handful of them left. So this is, including the idea of the atom. And the idea of the atom was very much grounded that it was a thing. And these days is, if you've read anything from quantum mechanics, you will know Heisenberg's quote of atoms are not things. And this turns out to be very much the case when talking about quantum mechanics. But quantum mechanics itself sounds a lot like fantasy. There's a lot of mystery behind quantum mechanics, which means there is mystery left in the universe. I seriously doubt we are ever going to know what's really going on. We are always going to have mysteries to explore. And in order to do that, we need an unfettered imagination. We need an imagination that goes outside of what we know to be true. And some people say, well, then, it's just a lie. It's just fiction. It's just false. That's a very narrow and very limited way of looking at it. When we allow our imaginations to run wild, we may bump into truths that we might not even be thinking about right now. We might actually fall right into a truth that our science today doesn't know anything about. But give us another 100 years, and that weird piece of fantasy may end up being, wow, this actually was a prediction. This was something that we've discovered is true, like multiverses. That's why I brought that up. That's why I brought that up. A lot of quantum mechanics talks about a necessity for multiple pathways, multiple universes, multiple choices. We're still uncertain about what that means. Well, that's when fantasy takes over and starts thinking about, what could it mean? What might this mean? And yes, fantasy is not meant to be taken as, some scientific truth. But we must remember that many scientific truths of just 50 years ago are considered incorrect today. Theories. Most of the things we take as scientific facts are not facts. They are theories. Theories have holes in them. The theory of relativity is still called a theory. It has proven itself over and over and over again. It's a strong theory. Still not quite a fact. The same is true for quantum mechanics. The same is true for even classical Newtonian physics. We have to be very careful about what we call facts. There are very few facts in this reality that we find ourselves in. So fantasy allows us to see beyond ourselves. It allows us to see past what is in front of us day to day. We get to dream while we are awake and rational and thinking. When we read a work of fantasy, we are dreaming while awake, and that gives us some advantages. We can think about it. We can ponder. We go, what does that mean? Well, what would I do if I were in this situation? Or if this was possible, wouldn't it have to be like this? You get to think about it. Whereas most often in a dream, the most you can do is respond to the dream. Here, when we're reading something, we can actually kind of intellectually dive into it, and we can emotionally attach ourselves to it and really shake it out. Are we enjoying this? Is this something that speaks to us? Is this something that calls to us? These fantasies. And that is also a very valid point, is that fantasy can speak to us through metaphor in ways that nonfiction cannot. Nonfiction talks about what actually happened, usually from a particular viewpoint. As is often said, history is written by the victors, which means history is tainted by the fact that it is being written by one point of view. With fantasy, that's not necessarily true. You can see what's inside your main villain's head. You can, hear the doubts and thoughts of the hero, if there are any. And we can look at it from multiple points of view. We can argue with one another. And people do. They argue about Lord of the Rings. They argue about, the Wheel of Time. They argue about, the white gold wielder and all these characters and books of fantasy. We can talk about the system that is behind the Elric saga of Michael Moorcock. We can, hash things out, talk about the balance and chaos versus law. All of these things are metaphors. And when we're discussing them, when we're thinking about them, when we're arguing about them, We are arguing about aspects of ourselves and our culture and how we as a people respond to things. These are our modern myths. These are the modern fables. And from them, like from the ancient alchemists of old, we may find new sciences, new arts, and new ways of thinking about our universe and our place in it. And that is why fantasy is vital as a genre of writing. It is an excellent way of taking in the big picture in a fun way that we can then, as readers, discuss, argue about, and enjoy. This brings a lot of richness to our lives and can lead to unexpected discoveries. I doubt that the ancient alchemists of old would have foreseen modern chemistry and metallurgical sciences. Oh, wow, okay, yeah, material sciences, yeah, that wasn't a thing back then. That wasn't even the glimmering of an idea back then. But now we have that because of the fantastical, myth-based, occult-based alchemists. Now we have chemistry and the material sciences that have risen from that flurry that's, well, let's face it, was a blizzard of myths, fables, and strange experiments and odd ideas. Fantasy takes that place. That's what fantasy does. We don't have a lot of that in our culture right now. So fantasy writing and fantasy books takes that place very well. How often do you sit and talk about fables and myths of old? Not so much anymore. But how often do you talk about your favorite fantasy novels? That's a different story altogether, and one that I think is a recurring theme with humanity, that we build these fantastical metaphors so we can better emotionally and intellectually deal with issues and ideas that are far beyond our current level of understanding. So I hope you have enjoyed this. Please do subscribe to David Galata Book Dreamer, and feel free to put in comments. I would love for some more comments to come in. I really like hearing from people. Next week we will be starting off the new year. Yeah, Happy New Year, everyone. By 2022. Yes, we're done with 2022. We're very done with 2022. I mean, personally, I did well during this year. It was a good year for me. Though the first half of this year was not so good. That's all personal stuff. But yeah, it's been a rough year for everyone. But to begin next year, I'm going to be talking about what humanity can learn from building orbitals. There we go. We're going to be talking about orbital habitats. So I will see you then. And in the meantime, I hope you have a very safe, warm, and happy new year. Take care, everyone, and thank you all for watching.